It's 6 o'clock in London, it's 1 p.m. in New York, it's 1 a.m. in Hong Kong, 3 a.m. in Sydney, 10:30 in Mumbai at night, and 10 a.m. in San Francisco. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world today. My name is Patrick L. Young. The IPO-VID live stream, series 14, episode number 05, which makes in the aggregate, because we've got a doctor of mathematics beside me today, episode number 83, ladies and gentlemen, starts here. And my goodness, how the sands have been shifting in crypto land. We called it Bit Carnage in Exchange Invest. And that's one of those days when you needed to have Exchange Invest as a subscriber. Ultimately, people will ask me why the great and the good of the exchange world are paying $300 per annum for Exchange Invest. And the answer is because we're worth it, ladies and gentlemen. This week, we already noted that FTX was likely hold below the waterline. To understand why FTX and Binance could yet have a sour ending, because yes, ladies and gentlemen, apparently a merger is in the works today, live in real time as we're coming to you from London. You need to read tomorrow's issue. Exchange Invest has been leading this week with what we call Bit Carnage. It looks like a Brazilian telenovela from some angles, but it's deadly serious with repercussions for the future of the crypto markets. And it isn't over yet. In fact, Bit Carnage is only just beginning. And of course, there is a subtle irony to this whole thing, ladies and gentlemen, because the news was not the blockchain's cryptocurrency exchange leaders disputing distributed ledgers, but actually they were going back to the very things that 500 years ago Italian merchants used to have on their banks, the benches, the simple old legacy balance sheet. Single ledgers bite the backside of the distributed ledger business. At least it proves that what some seek to call tradfi has its uses after all. Elsewhere, there's excellent news on the cusp of, well, actually the derivatives, the distributed ledger business and the overall nature of cash tradfi markets themselves. The Gibraltar Financial Services Commission, in their wisdom, have issued the change of control permissions for the Gibraltar Stock Exchange to become part of Valerium PLC, where I, Patrick L. Young, am Executive Director. Moreover, there is exciting news that the management change has been approved too. So once we close the deal next year, PLY will be in charge of the Gibraltar Stock Exchange, as well as remaining Executive Director at Valerium PLC. Some excellent results this week in the parish as well. There was a fourth consecutive beat from 4 in the past year by ICE. Coinbase improved, but still lost eye-popping amounts of money. An interesting theme in crypto land this week. And MOEX, the Moscow exchange, deserve plaudits for constantly coping with the macro environment in which they are entirely passengers. Remarkable performances, once again, from many exchange entities across the parish of exchanges. And of course, you could read it all in Exchange Invest Daily, the bulletin of the bourse business. At the water cooler tomorrow, of course, don't forget there's going to be lots more discussion of that Binance takeover of FTX. However, today we have got a scintillating guest. We are here in the nerve hub. We're underground, close to the heart of the city of London, in the bunkers that are known as the BMLL headquarters, where they're secretly creating a whole new world of data. The lake is bubbling just outside the office in which I'm sitting at the moment, where, of course, that 15 plus petabytes of data can be found. We are in a topic today of BMLL liquidity maps. Is it the data Magna Carta? And our guest today is the BMLL Chief Product Officer, Dr. Elliot Banks. He's responsible for data science, product development, and product delivery of BMLL's analytics and product suite to clients. Elliot is, despite the fact that you can't see it, ladies and gentlemen, perhaps it's behind his fringe, genuinely a pointy-headed mathematician. He's got an MMath from the University of Cambridge. I mean, the University of Cambridge. There aren't a lot of universities out there that just get that sort of an epithet. With a Cantabrian MMath and a PhD from an equally illustrious organization, Imperial College London, and that PhD is in theoretical physics, making, actually, interestingly enough, the second eminent physics doctorate to be on this show, because just a number of months ago we had subscriber number 1, Dr. Robert Barnes, who is his physics doctorate rather, comes from, I do believe, Harvard in Boston. So, Elliot, we all start with the same question. I'm going to ask you, where in the world are we today? But I might have given that away.
I think you gave a fantastic answer already, Patrick. I think we're in the heart of BMLL's office in London. We've been here all day. I managed to get in with the tube strikes and the train strikes. But we're in the office where we take our level 3 data, put it into the cloud, and make it available for all.
That's absolutely fabulous altogether, elegantly modelling. And I have to say, actually, remarkably, London's infrastructure is holding up. It seems to me that actually London's infrastructure works better when they're threatening to strike than it does when they actually say that it's going to be normal. But there you go. It's probably just my sort of thing. Let me say hello to a few of our regulars. Good evening, Peter Secon. It's lovely to see you. I hope you and Ari are doing well this evening. Let me also say hello to Marcus Ward, because I seem to be hitting the wrong buttons here. So thank you very much, Peter, for your greeting. Hello, Marcus Ward. Congratulations to Marcus Ward, incidentally, on his engagement recently. There's his lovely fiancée in the picture today. And let me also say thank you very much for your congratulations on our deal. We're getting there. We're going to close in the first quarter of next year, Marcus, but everything's looking very, very encouraging to manage to come down as plain sailing. We've just got to do the paperwork, bit of I dotting and T crossing. More importantly, Magnus, congratulations on your engagement. That's fabulous news altogether. We're looking forward to seeing some pictures of the wedding in due course on a future IPO-VID. So, explain to me a little bit of this journey. I mean, you've come to this fascinating entrepot, BMLL liquidity maps, the data Magna Carta we're going to get onto in a moment. But explain to me a little bit of your background, Elliot. How did you get to the City of London? I'm sure it wasn't an entirely linear path.
No, it was very non-linear. So I started off after my undergraduate. I went and worked for Macquarie, buying toll roads, airports in their private equity division. So I did that for a little bit, and then decided after that I'd go back to school and become a quant. So I did my PhD in theoretical physics. Worked actually for Nectarcard for a little bit, helping during my PhD, helping them to understand their recommendation engines, and then ended up almost 6 years ago now at BMLL. So started off there as a data scientist, helping build out a lot of the underlying technology that we built. And it was really 3 years ago then that we'd sort of taken a lot of the underlying technology, which is around the time that Paul came, that I shifted positions to help productize a lot of the underlying tech that we built, going from a good piece of technology to actually a product that people in the market could really use to help them day to day.
So quite fascinating. I mean, BMLL, we got the history of BMLL to a reasonable degree with Paul when he was a guest. So you can catch that back issue with Paul Humphrey, the CEO. He unfortunately can't be with us this week because he's out of the office, which is why we've taken over his office, and we're going to have a fabulous party in here later on if you're watching, Paul. So anyway, while we prepare the many open bottles and all of the other exciting things, the streamers, etc., that are going to be taking place in the party in Paul's office later. So you had this interesting trajectory. BMLL, I mean, it's had amazing past few years because, as you say, productizing what was originally a lot of very theoretical product must have been quite a challenge.
Yeah, I think look, the original founders were incredibly bloody minded and were able to, articulate that vision enough to get the initial data set in. And then what we really had to do and think about was, okay, well, what are the messages and how can people actually use that data day to day? What are the types of things people actually want to understand from that data? And it's hard to conceptualize when you're talking about, a petabyte scale data lake in terms of what that actually means and how you can use it. So we had to think a lot about simplifying the messaging, making sure that it went from being quite an academic thing to actually what do I need to use to do this in practice? Okay, what types of data might I want to use? How do I compare different venues, for example? That was a big part of what we did, and ultimately culminated this year launching BMLL Vantage and having a visual product to then be able to sit and see it as well, as well as having the sort of analytics products that people could use to get things off the shelf to make it easy and simple to understand.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite incredible. As you say, I mean, petabyte of data is something that really everybody struggles with. I mean, it's like those discussions about how big the universe is, and people start talking about raisins in Montenegro and peanuts in Johannesburg and things like that. It's incredibly difficult. And you've got whatever it is, 15 or something petabytes of data. So you've been adding to that, I do believe, since we talked to Paul last year.
Yeah.
So your comprehensivity is now increasingly global.
Indeed. So we've added, we've completed our US build out now. We've pretty much completed Europe. And our recent fundraising is really going to help us to continue to extend that coverage. We'll be looking to go into Asia, to add Canada, to add rest of the world equities, as well as solidifying the futures offering as well, which currently is the entirety of ICE, CME and Eurex. And I think one of the ways, going back to that, conceptualizing that 15 petabytes, take one ETF. Take the largest ETF, SPY, in the US. That's 20 million messages for one day. Okay. One ETF, one day, and you think, well, that's across that's across the main venues, but then you've got all of the other venues, you've got all of the other ETFs, all of the equities that trade. That's just in the US. There's 40,000 order books in the US in a given day, a similar number of Europe, and then the futures markets are a more order of magnitude more liquid than that. And we've got 7 years of US history, 5 years of Europe, 3 years of the futures. You combine all of that together, and that's the number of messages you're just getting on one day of data. And then we've got that across the board. So it's an enormous amount of data to process and to understand. And really, what we're trying to do more than anything is make that usable, make that consumable, and make that something that people can actually take and use day to day, whether you're in the buy side, whether you're in the sell side, whether you're an exchange itself, trying to understand, well, how am I actually doing as a venue compared to everything else.
So let's talk about that. I mean, how do you actually make this work? Because you talk about the visual product, and that's really the whole new thing about Vantage. And you're trying to provide, I mean, I've called it the data Magna Carta, because in many ways that's what it is. At least it strikes me in my ignorance that you've got something that looks like that. Do you want to give us a little demonstration of how that works?
Yeah.
Actually, we can draw it up on the screen.
If we get it up on the screen.
So if we bring that up onto the screen, please. And here we go.
Fantastic. So, and I thought I wouldn't spend too type of complexity that you really have to deal with here. What we've got here is I've got BMLL Vantage, and I've pulled up a Eurostoxx 50. So a sort of a collection of 50 most liquid stocks in Europe. And these are all the different execution mechanisms in Europe you can trade on. And it's looking over the last 90 days, but the picture would be the same over time. And this is on a percentage basis. I can look in terms of an absolute basis as well and see how the volumes have changed and behaved. Now, this is the type of complexity that is very, very difficult for someone to come in and understand, as an exchange, for example, what's my market share?
Right.
How have I done? You've got to go pull in all these data from these different venues, normalize it, make sense of it, because here we've removed liquidity that isn't addressable for all participants, liquidity that isn't, sort of real liquidity that I could touch and interact with, and then put it into a format so I can see, okay, during the continuous trading period, during an auction, during a block mechanism, how are these different venues behaving? And that's what we've been able to do in Europe. We've done the same thing in the US. We'll continue to adding this across the board. And this is one metric. This is one analytic. We actually have over 300 different analytics in Vantage, from looking at the behavior of the auction to looking at how much depth is there in the order book, to looking at how long orders actually rest on the order book, or what's the probability of actually getting filled on the order book. All of those things can be pulled up, can be turned into a data set to take away all the noise, to then get something really simple answer, like the question like, well, what's the probability I actually get filled on that venue? To do that, I have to get all the venues. I have to get every single order that's come through. So I have to say, has that been filled? Has that been cancelled? Has that amended? Trace all of that through, all of those millions and millions of messages, and then turn it into a simple number. And that's the sort of thing which BMLL Vantage gives a really, really quick and easily pictorial view of, or you can take it as a data set and use it to ultimately understand how the market is behaving. Okay,
so if I've got this data set in front of me, say, for example, I'm an exchange.
Yeah.
what might I be looking for in these incredibly spectacular pictures, which look rather like, I don't know, something like the backdrop from the Yellow Submarine movie of the Beatles? What exactly can I find that's going to help me understand how my exchange might work better? Or
so the first thing, obviously, is actually looking at the market share.
Okay.
You know, here we've pulled out all of the different mechanisms, but I could just start simply and say, well, let's just get something simple like a spread. Let's look at the spread. Let's actually see how have different venues, if I show by different venues, how are they actually behaving in terms of spread. Or I could look on it in box plot and actually see how have different venues over time, what is their average spread looking like. If I zoom in, I can then see how they're doing and how they're behaving. A little bit dark in here. We can then see how they're behaving over time, and actually follow that. Equally, I could then turn that into a plot, so I can see as a venue, and perhaps maybe I look on a different venue, say what's happening on the UK. How are different venues behaving over time from a spread basis, from how long they're behaving at EBBO, follow how they're doing and see how these different venues are doing from that perspective. And that allows me to quickly and easily, compare venues, see how is it done over time and track that performance.
Fabulous. So therefore, I can really get a better understanding in a dashboard of what my exchange is doing well or what my exchange is doing badly, or where I can possibly tweak performance. But presumably then it becomes quite interesting because everything has a consequence. Right?
Yeah.
So therefore, I can see in real time if I tweak point A, what takes place.
Exactly. So you could follow, and I'm pulling back that classified trades view. You could actually see, okay, how have I done over the past X number of days? Is my market share going up? Is it going down? Am I losing or gaining share compared to my peers? You can see actually the LSE has gone up in the last few days in terms of its share. So you can start to see how those shares are being tuned and are being tweaked, and understand, okay, am I losing? Am I gaining ground compared to my peers? But also what is happening as you go and evolve over time.
Very interesting. Now, one of the things then strikes me is you've just mentioned the fact that you're adding all of the futures and derivatives data at the same time. But don't you end up with sort of an apples and oranges in the different data sets? I mean, presumably you don't compare the futures business to the cash equity business per se.
No.
You're comparing one with...
No, absolutely not. This is about comparing like venues. So this is about looking across Vodafone, say, and all the different venues and how are they behaving, or looking at say on a futures venue, understanding how a product is doing across.
Okay. And now, if you've got, though, say something like a Vodafone that also has single stock futures, is there a way that I can start looking at those and start, at least they won't be apples, they will be apples to oranges in some degree, but I can start looking at comparisons?
So BMLL Vantage is only equities at the moment.
Okay.
Our other products are futures, and customers already will start to look at behavior between not only, say, a single stock future and the underlying, but how is an ETF doing? And we did an article on this last year. Actually, we looked at the behavior between the E-mini, obviously on the CME, and SPY, the S&P 500 ETF, and looked at the impact between the two and actually which one of those was driving each other.
That's a very interesting point, and that's actually where I was coming to, because obviously then, so you can start to discern as you're working your way through the product what's driving other things.
Exactly. So what you can do is you can start to say, okay, historically, what times is the ETF driving the impact of the future? What other times is the future driving the ETF? And can I then use that to build into a trading decision? Can I use that to understand, where there might be more or less liquidity? If I'm a venue, I might want to understand that to know, okay, why am I losing market share then? Or is there a reason why I'm seeing more market behavior, more activity here, less activity? So all of that helps you build up this picture of what's going in the details of the market.
Very interesting. So we can see immediately how an exchange might use it. I think we can use our masculine intuition to discern what's going on, but I'm going to ask you the question anyway. Without telling us the secret sauce of what you might know from what your clients are using, how does the tool really impact upon the work of, say, a broker?
So I think in a lot of ways, the exchanges, and what we've got up here is a good visualization of how different markets have what market share is doing, but there's clearly a whole suite of metrics. Understanding which venue is the best from a probability of being filled, which venue is setting a European best bid offer the most time, which one has liquidity with the most liquidity within MBBO. All of those questions are something someone on the sell side, a broker, wants to understand, because ultimately that's going to help them understand where to route, where to make that trade, which venues to go to. And by taking in this data and turning that into a simple data set, turning that into a nice visual, you can quickly go, oh, okay, actually I can see exactly why that was the right that venue. Or actually we've had some customers tell us, oh, intuitively, this venue seems to do very well in these conditions, but we've never been able to prove it.
Okay.
Now you've got the data set to be able to say, actually, yeah, I am getting better fills then, because I can see compared to the rest of the market, this is going on. Or actually, I'm not getting, that venue does feel like at these times of day, liquidity drops off, or in these conditions. And that's what you can pull out from Vantage visually, or you can then go into the data lab and the data feed to then be able to actually query that data event by event, order by order.
Very, very interesting. And you mentioned there, obviously, NBBO, which is really the American concept of national best bid and offer. But therefore, presumably, you also must get some quite intriguing insights between how stocks trade in different parts of the world.
Yes. So we obviously take, for example, in fact, I could pull this up. I could look at an instrument and I could look at Apple. And I will see I have Apple on NASDAQ, but I also have all the GDRs that are trading on the different venues. So I can actually see how is liquidity doing between the two. In some of our intraday metrics, I could actually say how much liquidity is there for Apple on NASDAQ versus in Europe. When does the liquidity pick up? And actually, one thing we looked at a while ago for one customer, you could basically see, we were looking at visualizing the order book, and you could see when you started to dig into it, when the market makers were kicking in, there was more liquidity and more market makers kicking in Europe when on the ADRs, when the US woke up. So the US starts, and you start to see additional market maker behavior coming in. You start to see more orders sitting up sort of, at the sort of clearly was the furthest amount from their rebates point of view, sitting there, and you clearly got more market maker activity happening once the US wakes up on the European stocks, which are traded as well in the US.
And I think intuitively we've all felt that for years, but now you're proving the fact that it actually does fundamentally improve. That's very, very interesting stuff all round. And let me just break off at this point in time to say thank you very much, Simon Huckle, for your greetings. Good evening to you, Simon. It's great to hear from you all together. I also see that he is watching the show this evening, the CEO of BMLL, complaining and worried that we're going to ruin the furniture at the after party. Don't worry, Paul. The Fire Eater is staying outside, and the very interesting Moroccan Japanese calligrapher is going to do some very, very tasteful stencils across your room. You will barely notice the difference. It will be so splendid altogether. Thank you for checking in there, BMLL's CEO and also IPO-VID alumnus, Paul Humphrey. So we're here discussing BMLL liquidity maps and the data Magna Carta. How many of these different kinds of maps are there, or is there essentially an infinite number depending on how your imagination works?
So I think there are some standard types of visualization. There are some standard types of analysis and data points people want to make. I think what we've done and where we're really seeing, certainly the customers moving forward with this is they're able to answer questions that they just didn't know was possible before.
Right.
And I think so. So there's a lot of, take something like a fill probability or a resting time. We sort of those are the sort of metrics we sort of built up over 2 or 3 years, and talking to a lot of customers, and you'd go and you'd sort of say, hey, this is what we're going to do, and they'd say, oh, that's not, you can't really do that, or it's that's really difficult, it's not something we've ever looked at. And then you show them this, hey, this is how this venue actually, the chance of being filled versus this venue. They suddenly go, oh, wow, that's really powerful. And then you start to build out, okay, how do you want to represent that? What's the type of data set that you want? Because some customers will just want this directly as a data set, put into a database, let their quants go away, deal with it. Others will want to actually put that in a nice visualization, answer that question, have a business or a sales discussion about it, and then use it going forward. And similarly on the exchanges, they'll want to, some of the exchanges, some of the quants there will want to dive into it, dive into the details, into the numbers. Others just want a visualization or a story to be painted with it. So Vantage itself gives like a whole range of different ways to visualize the data, but actually with these, really the power of the metrics, it's so wide and so enormous that you can sort of almost cut and slice, especially in using the underlying level 3 data.
Yep.
Almost anything, because at the end of the day, we have the most granular view of the market that is publicly available.
Right. And that becomes then very interesting, because certainly I can see how at multiple different levels of the business, people are going to be interested in perhaps not the real-time thing, but I can certainly see how it's fabulous. If you're a broker, you can justify to your client what you've been doing. If you're a fund manager, you can very easily go back to the powers that be and demonstrate that you haven't been squandering their money when you've actually been buying and selling, which starts becoming very, very important in terms of removing that frictional cost that is, and actually is still very, very significant in particularly the cash equities business. I mean, futures and options, which essentially commissions are more or less nothing. It's not quite the same thing, but of course the market impact is a huge issue for everybody. And therefore I can see that has a huge impact. I mean, everybody who's ever put together a set of KPIs for a board book is presumably absolutely drooling over the possibility of managing to demonstrate how they justify the piece in the particular in the marketplace. But I mean, in real time, what are the ways then that you can look at this and potentially change what you're doing, whether you're a broker or a trader or an exchange? What are the sort of examples of things that people may do if they're looking at this data, and how does that change their behavior?
Yeah, so let's maybe start with the exchange use case. So there we have customers who will take in this data every day, and they'll generate a morning report that they'll go and look at and say, our market share has dropped on these KPIs, or it's gone up. These are how the KPIs are doing. We need to feed that back into, schemes around, incentivizing LPs, understanding how LPs are actually performing, to then tune that into business decision making. So it's not going to happen, the same day, because that's not how, exchanges don't work on that speed. But it gives them the ability in sort of business real time to be able to make that decision. Now, it's a different story with the brokers. A lot of brokers will maybe calibrate a smart order router once a day, start trading. There, they'll take these metrics in and use that to actually feed, recalibrate models. I've got a model which will choose how I go and choose and route my orders. I might take that in ahead of time in the morning to say, well, actually, that venue, statistically, it's going up. The chance of getting filled there, I need to recalibrate how often I'm going to route my orders there, so I can then do that more often. And then we've also got the ability to provide that context. So we'll have customers who'll be trading real time, but we'll look back and say, okay, the spread, it might feel like it's a wide spread, but is that really a wide spread or not compared to the last 30 days at that point in time? And that's where, by pulling in this data, you can say, well, actually, I can see this is the spread now, and I can see, historically, actually, this is a really wide spread compared to what I was doing. I don't want to pay that cost right now, because actually, it's not worth it. There's no significant event as to why that's happening. So it's contextualizing what's happening in real time with all the history to make it easy to make that decision. And it's almost removing, that sort of anecdotal insight and replacing it with sort of statistical insight and facts.
Which is obviously very key, because a lot of people for a long time have been trying to do this, but they've been relying on their gut instinct. And that can obviously be skewed by all manner of different things that are happening in the market. And therefore, when you're looking at these sorts of things, presumably also it gives incredible insight into very high volatility days. I mean, just over the course of the last couple of years with COVID, we've had some quite spectacular market moves. Do you find that people gain more insight out of high volatility, or does it not really matter?
So look, I think there's different things that you're looking at there. So if it's high volatility, you know, what you're trying to understand is how has a particular stock behaved on that day, and what if anything could I see that will help me learn going forward in similar volatile times. When it's less volatile, you know, there's still a lot to be understood in terms of fragmentation. So whether you're looking at fragmentation in the US, in Europe, or trying to understand how has, say, an ICE future done compared to a CME future at the same time, trying to understand that cross-product analysis. Even in less volatile times, there's still a lot to learn and understand from a trading behavior. Now, when it becomes more volatile, some of those questions become less important relative to the volatility that you're seeing. And so there's questions that you can answer at all scales. But absolutely, we looked. I remember when the whole GameStop phenomena came up, and we did a big piece on that, looking at what was happening, sort of nanosecond by nanosecond, event by event throughout the day, and you could just see this spike in insertion rates and cancellation rates. You could see how the depth of the order book was changing, and that's the sort of thing where, you know, if something like this happens again, by looking at the historical events, that can maybe help your decision making going forward.
That's really, really fascinating. We're here with Dr. Elliot Banks. We're discussing BMLL liquidity maps, the data Magna Carta. We are already halfway through the show. So that's the metric I have to give you. We certainly don't generate 15 petabytes of data during the course of the average hour around here. I'm not sure that we even generate the 30 megabytes or so that you were talking about earlier from a day of an ETF, Elliot. But it's certainly absolutely fascinating what you're talking about. Let me just also pass to the comments and say, well, thank you very, very much, Peter Second, for your comment. You're looking forward to reading this with a brew in the morning. Yes, it may have to be heavily caffeinated, I'm sure, to manage to get you through, but nonetheless, it's quite fascinating what we're talking about. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're enjoying this, I mean, please give us a little bit of a like, would you? I mean, we really could do with all the likes we get, because the algorithms, in this case, they're not controlled by BMLL Vantage, and we can't get insights from BMLL Vantage yet, but there you go. There's something you could be working on, Paul Humphrey, in the near future, once you've cured the world's financial markets. In order to get ourselves up the algorithms, we need likes. So if you're watching this and you like it, leave us a comment, ask a question, give us a like, because the AI is watching us and the bots love being able to see interaction, ladies and gentlemen. And that really helps us bring the message forward about all of these sorts of fascinating developments in market. So, Elliot, I mean, from your perspective, what's the element that you're actually most proud of in terms of what BMLL Vantage is doing or has delivered?
I think it's allowing people to see the markets differently. And I think that what we had and what we built with our original product was an incredibly powerful tool for data scientists, analysts to come in, and they didn't, it wasn't a difficult environment to do, but you still need to know a little bit of Python. I think what we've done now is democratize that, and that ability to do that data analysis to anyone. Anyone can come in now, can look at how the market is behaving, can look at how venues are comparing, what's happening deep within the order book, and actually use that to make insight. And I think, the amount of people we've spoken to who, have told us over the years, we love what you do, but we don't have resource. We don't have quant resource. Quants are an increasingly rare resource.
Yes.
It's harder and harder to find good quality data scientists and analysts because they're just so in demand.
Yep.
And actually having a tool like this that becomes easy and simple for anyone to come in, utilize, and to answer those questions about which is the best venue, about what is the market impact of this particular stock, to be able to look back over 3-5 years and say, well, what has the impact of regulation been, and not have to ever type anything into a keyboard, just be able to quickly point, a few clicks, a few images, a few plots, and suddenly you've got that rich tapestry of understanding. That's a really, really powerful thing. And I think it's something we've spent a lot of time and effort thinking about the workflow and just making it as simple as possible for people to get access to this type of data.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I used the title, the Data Magna Carta, on this whole thing, because it does simplify and allows everybody to play. As you say, you don't need data scraping technology. You don't need to understand Python. I think it's a great point because you make about, well, actually, the number of data scientists, although they're increasing, they're in incredible demand. The old stream of pointy-headed rocket scientists that we could all rely on for so long after the Cold War seems to be drying up, because we seem to be back into A, another Cold War, B, there have been, what, 50 different private satellite launches just by the largest players in the United States of America so far this year. So therefore, all of these people are in demand, and thus that you can actually go and look. And this has really become like the old-fashioned data stream. I mean, for those who remember those things going back, ladies and gentlemen, we used to be able to get all known statistics on one single screen, and it became a really, really powerful tool. So what do you think is going to be, I mean, what actually are you working on that you can tell us about that are the next steps with Vantage?
So it's all going to be about coverage for us. You know, we've got US, we've got Europe, we've got sort of 7 years now of history in the US. We've got 5 in Europe, so they've got that deep, rich history. For us, and a lot of what we're looking to build out over the next year is our content. So we'll be looking to onboard Asia, we'll be looking to onboard Canada, we'll be looking to really grow out the markets across the board to be able to access as much data as we can, and continuing that ability to look cross market. And that's really what we want to be able to do. You know, the questions that we've answered in Europe, in the US, they are similar questions in Japan, in Australia, in Canada, in those fragmented markets, but also in other markets, to be able to quickly and easily scan across the board and say, okay, I want to understand these markets. I want to be able to pull out this information, because ultimately, you know, trading is a global business. It's not a European, US-centric thing. There's huge amounts of liquidity in the Asian markets. There's huge amount of liquidity in the Canadian markets and global markets. And we want to onboard as many data sets as possible to really give that whole picture of how the market is behaving.
Absolutely fascinating. We're temporarily in a dark market here, ladies and gentlemen. I know that because I used to be a director of LiquidNet, so therefore I understand these things. Let's add some brightness and transparency back into things in just a second. I'm going to jump up and get it sorted. But first, I'm going to leave you, Elliot, with this great question from Chris Messina, himself an IPO-VID alumni. Chris is asking, how much transparency do you provide to users inside the black box which kicks out the results?
So everything built in BMLL Vantage is built from our underlying, and now we're in a lit market again. Everything in BMLL Vantage is built from our underlying data lab product. That takes every single message from the exchange, every insertion, cancellation, correction at full depth. So that's level 3 data. So we can see absolutely everything. We have built the analytics and the metrics from exactly the same product that we provide through the BMLL data lab. So it's completely transparent. You can understand exactly how every calculation is done. And if you do have data scientists and quants, they can go into the lab and actually tune those metrics in the lab itself to be able to use. And I think it is a really important thing in this. You know, it's so easy to get a statistic, get a number, and people will quite easily, willingly use it without really knowing why that number has come from. What are the assumptions that have gone into it? What's the calculation? And that's one of the things we're really keen to change in that model, that you've got Vantage, which has, you know, it has the transparency, it has the visibility over the data, but you can then go into the data lab if you want and actually calculate those underlying metrics to make sure it's a consistent thing all the way through. You know what numbers, what assumptions have gone in to make something. So if you want actually a different number, if you're thinking about it in a slightly different way, that's how your trading model works. Say if you're a broker, you can still use that information, but you've got a great starting point.
That is, I think, a great answer. Chris Messina, I really appreciate your question. By all means, come back if you've got a follow-up to that. I hope that has helped illuminate you. At the same point in time, thank you very much, Batty Young, for having fear of missing out about that after party with the lights going off already. But I'm glad to see you rapidly followed up by pointing out, women on it, that you are lit. Let me just interrupt at this point in time so that Elliot gets a chance to have a sip of water while we're discussing BMLL, liquidity maps to data, Magna, Carta with Dr. Elliot Banks here in the headquarters of the massive 15 plus petabyte lake of data, which is BMLL, and their many, many tools. To say tomorrow evening, ladies and gentlemen, slightly earlier than this, it's going to be, well, 22 hours from now, I do believe. You've got to be tuning in because it will be lit. It's going to be women on it. They've got the absolutely incomparably brilliant Cindy Gallop. If you don't know who Cindy Gallop is, well, check out her Ice House podcast, which we managed to organize for her a couple of years back. Look at all of her on-stream content and be prepared for what is going to be an absolutely fantastic PhD, Positivity Hack, delivered on the Women On It channel, and it is going to be beyond phenomenal. I cannot wait. So thank you very much for your messages there, Women On It and Beata Young. Now, Elliot, one of the things that occurred to me, you're talking about building out this data lake. You've talked a lot about, obviously, competitive venues, comparing things and so on. Yes, that's fabulous when you're talking about the stocks that I would call super liquid. And you've mentioned, Apple, Vodafone, things that are household names either in their own regions or right across the world. What about using Vantage when you're dealing with smaller markets? I mean, if you're dealing with a small national stock exchange or something, is there actually an advantage to having that data in BMLL? And if so, what are we likely to be able to learn about it?
So I think the advantage there is, I mean, the answer is yes. There's certainly value to get from less liquid markets in terms of having this data. And I think it's about having it in a consistent format as much as anything. Actually understanding, the trades on that venue, how they're comparing to others. And, from an exchange point of view, we've got some exchanges who look at our venues not necessarily because they're looking at their own market, say if they're a single venue, but actually understanding what other venues have introduced. Okay, I'm a single venue. What has the impact been of periodic auctions? What has the impact been on dark pools on those particular venues? Has it increased? Has it improved? Has it changed liquidity? And actually, would you want to introduce it yourself? Another hot topic, which is certainly under discussion in the US at the moment, is tick size rules. Right. Actually understanding, okay, you've got Europe and the US, which are kind of polar opposites when it comes to how they treat tick sizes. Understanding what does a change in tick size mean in terms of liquidity for my participants, in terms of how will that increase liquidity to the venue or decrease? Now you can use BMLL Vantage to scan that across liquid venues, but you can then also compare it to what's going on other venues and say, okay, have I got similar dynamics? Have I got different dynamics? How has that behaved? But the key point across all of this, the data set is consistent. Right. It doesn't matter if I'm looking at London, at Tokyo, at New York, at Prague, at Budapest, Vienna, anywhere I'm looking, I've got a consistent data set that I can build from. And therefore, when I'm doing my analysis, whatever venue I'm looking at, I can make it consistent.
That's very interesting. So the consistent data is the point. Therefore, I can also say, I mean, presumably there is a usage for, we've talked about the buy side, the sell side, the exchanges, the market providers. Presumably there's also a very interesting use case within Vantage for the regulators to understand what's going on. Yeah,
well, we sort of, as we publicly stated, the FCA is a customer of us, trying to understand how, using us to understand and ask regulatory questions. Right. With our data, we've got years of history. You can look back and actually say, okay, what has the impact of MiFID II been on liquidity in different venues? What has that meant from a liquidity in the depth of the order book, from an average spread, from a cost to participants? Similarly, we've got customers in the US, and we actually I did a webinar on this recently where we looked at tick size rules and actually what is the optimal tick size, and it's a hot topic of regulation at the moment in the US, and that's the sort of by looking at this, you can sort of look not just at, okay, how is this stock trading or how is this set of stock trading, but actually what does this mean for the market and the structure of the market if I look across, and how has that changed over time? And importantly, you know, we've not just got the liquid end of the market here. We've gone right through to the illiquid end. And it's the same on our, you know, whenever we take a data set, we take everything. You know, we have on the future side, for example, we have every butterfly, condor, every sort of strategy trade that is on there. We don't just take, say, the outrights and
execution.
Exactly. So you can actually build out a full picture of the complex in futures, or build out a full picture of the market and equities. We're not just taking the liquid end of the market when we're taking a market. We're taking absolutely everything through our system, and that's part of the power of it. You've then got everything in a scalable environment, whether you're visually looking at it or whether you're sort of diving into the underlying data.
Okay, and therefore also in the equity side, you can actually tell from the historical record when people were putting through blocks and what those were, etc. And obviously then you can also tell on the derivative side, actually, when people are putting through blocks of whether it's futures or more complicated strategies. That becomes very, very interesting and incredibly powerful tool, I'm sure. What about applying this data? Have you started or looked at using it for beyond the equity and pure futures markets into things like crypto markets and stuff like that?
So I think, and one of the things in an early stage company is you can get dragged in a lot of directions, you know. And one of the things, certainly in my role the last few years, is about making sure, from a product perspective, we focus on really getting good at the stuff we're good at. You know, we really want to stay on our rails. And one of the things, you know, for us, we want to really get golden in the asset classes we're in. So we've spoken about, you know, equities and futures. We also have ETFs. So those three asset classes for us are the ones we want to focus on first and foremost. Get right. Once we've got that, there's no reason these same sort of questions can't be answered in FX, in crypto, in fixed income. All of these different asset classes. You know, we take order book venues, we take RFQ venues as well. So we have the likes of TradeWeb already on the ETF side in our system. So we take those venues. So we're used to processing, dealing with the data. From our technology point of view, it's just data. It comes in. There's obviously some specialism in making sure that you can consume it and it's usable. But ultimately, you know, for us, the first stage of our growth and expansion is about really pinning down those asset classes and getting them right, and then from there we'll look across, because ultimately, you know, we want to be that historical database across the board.
Very interesting. A slight design for living and world domination there is ultimately. So how many petabytes of data do you think you get to? That is the question. Is always the thing I'm always interested in. I mean, that's going to be quite a colossal expansion of your databases as you go along. We got a great question here from Elliot Schlamp. Thank you very much for your question, Stefan. Thank you also to everybody else who's been asking questions this evening. Elliot, I wonder if the biggest remaining barrier is the license to all venues data. This makes it costly to make an exploratory, I wonder what, study. Do you think that a pay-as-you-use data license would enable more or better research? It's a great question, isn't it?
It is a fantastic,
really thought-provoking, actually. Don't know where you came up with that one, Stefan, but definitely keep drinking what you're drinking. That's super.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's a couple of things here. One, in the very early days of BMLL, we did have a pay-as-you-go model, and I will tell you, the quickest way to annoy procurement is at a large organization is to come with a pay-as-you-go model. It just does not. It doesn't work, because from that point of view, it's very, very difficult for them to get a gauge on costs. It was a big barrier to cloud in the early days as well. You know, when you have the Amazon model of, you know, you get 10,000 line items of different things, which can just keep going up in cost. So we moved to much more of a subscription SaaS-based service. Having said that, you know, for different use cases and different types of analysis, we certainly have different licenses that are available there, and you know, some of our tools are very much more of a model of, you know, it's you pay per venue. Others are, okay, you can have X number of securities and you can query it, and depending on the use case, it then ramps up. But it's certainly getting pricing right at an early stage company is something that is always a challenge in the early days, and it's something that we spend a lot of time talking to a lot of customers, getting the model that was right for us and for them ultimately.
Very interesting altogether. Stefan, I hope that answers your question. It's certainly a great question. Really appreciate it. Thank you very, very much. And I mean, looking at that, you spent a lot of time talking about the sort of the productization of what you have here. Are there any ways that you can see immediately that building on Vantage, there's stuff that you're really going to have to do fundamentally, or is it tweaking now what's here?
I think one of the things we've spent a lot of time on the last few years is getting the tech right. And as Paul said in his IPO-VID, what we've built is a big, long effort. We had a long period where there was no revenue coming in. Our early early founder was sort of single-minded enough to actually go out and build what most people would tell you is basically impossible to do, certainly to do well. And a lot of what we've spent time doing was getting that tech right, so it's scalable. I think where the technology challenge is for us going forward is really it's about continuing to add that data. I think for us it's more of a tuning thing. There's certainly a lot of features we want to look to build into Vantage, but we've now, if you like, got the baseline and the frameworks that it becomes very easy to build on top of. And that's why I think for us next year is such an exciting period, because we're going to have this continuous stream of content coming in, and it really is sort of a crank the dial up, and you get this much richer, continually richer product by being able to get in all that data.
So while you were building up Vantage, I mean, one of the things that was obvious was we had COVID, you were in lockdown, nobody could go anywhere. And actually, I think the last time we met, we were actually having dinner in Boca Raton in Florida, which was so exciting. We came out into the blinking sunlight of Florida, and we were able to actually meet people in 3 dimensions. It was so intriguing after all of those years behind our desks. You've been on the road a lot. You've done a lot of traveling. You were at the international, the FISD just last month, talking about market data and so on. Have you found any particular difference in how people approach or look at the BMLL Vantage product depending on the region in the world they're in?
So certainly there are different questions people are trying to ask in the US and Europe. I think we've alluded to a few. There's clearly big differences from a market structure point of view in those two regions, but at the same time, the types of questions they're trying to ask, the fundamental thing they're trying to understand is the same. It's just a difference in the details, if you like, of how each region varies. I think the idea that quant resources is scarce and that you need more tools for people who don't necessarily code but still want to get and understand those insights. I think that's pretty universal, really. That's not a problem limited to one region. But I think the types of questions you might ask might be subtly different, and that's where we have some specific European, some specific US metrics helping to answer those slightly different questions come in. But ultimately, the thing we're doing, the hardest thing that any of them got is taking all of this data in at level 3 depth, having that there and being able to actually turning it into something meaningful. And that is a challenge which is going to go right across the board.
That is absolutely fascinating, Elliot. And therefore, I've got to ask you the question that we always ask at this time in the show. So where do you think the capital market revolution goes next?
Well, look, I think 10 years ago, it was all talk of speed.
Yes.
I think where we now are, and really with the growth of adoption of cloud and the ability for people to actually process and consume this data, means the race is really on for data and for information. And I think the wealth and the vastness of information means that more and more focus is going to be on using this information to actually affect trading decisions, or affect how your venue works, or affect the ultimate decision of how, say, your algorithm behaves. And I think what we're going to see is a real continued demand for not only data points themselves, but data that's in a relevant, useful way that people can ultimately use to help them better make decisions.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen, the race is for data and information. We're looking for effects rather than location, if this were real estate, and ultimately how people can manage to build that and put it together. I think it's a phenomenally interesting moment in the BMLL Vantage landscape. I want to say thank you very, very much. Thank you, Chris Messina. Great chat, guys. Elliot, I look forward to finding time to speak with you in more depth. How appropriate for level 3. The conversation is going there, Chris Messina. Hope you've been out and voted as well, if I may say so. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're in the United States of America today, exercise your franchise. It's important that as many people as possible get out there and vote, please. Thank you very much, Lee Ball. Great show, guys. Excellent insight. And we really appreciate everybody who's been talking today. Lee Ball, Peter Second, Marcus Ward, Paul Humphrey, Simon Huckle, Chris Messina, Beata Young, Woman on It. Remember, Hack the Future tomorrow evening with that Cindy Gallop special. Stefan Schlamp, that was a sensational question. Thoroughly appreciated it all together. We are looking forward to next week's show, which is going to be an absolutely fascinating one. We're going to be reinventing banking with the author of the book of the same name, Alessandro Hattami. That should be a gripping show. Same time, same place next week. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Patrick L. Young. It just leaves me to say thank you very much to everybody who helped with this show this evening. Thank you, Paul Humphrey, in absentia. We promise we won't wreck your office entirely this evening, but we'll certainly leave it so that you won't forget that we've been here. And at the same time, I want to say thank you to my guest this evening, Dr. Elliot Banks. It's been superb. To our production team, Jamil, Mary, Racy, Beata, you've done a great job. And also, last but by no means least, lurking somewhere in the office still at this time of the evening, Leonie, thank you very, very much for being an excellent host and organizer from the BMLL side. Ladies and gentlemen, Patrick L. Young, I wish you a great week in life and markets. Don't forget to watch Cindy Gallop tomorrow. And also, don't forget, if you're a subscriber, to make sure that you're reading tomorrow's edition of Exchange Invest, where we're going to have all of the skinny on what's going to happen next now that Binance are acquiring FTX. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I wish you all a great week in life and markets. And indeed, good luck on level 3, exploring your BMLL Data Magna Carta, the Vantage product.